So, you've just been born. Congratulations. While other babies are being gently wrapped in linen and destined to become bakers, blacksmiths, or, if they're really lucky, monks who get to copy pretty letters all day, you're being held by a mother whose hands permanently smell like something died. Because they do. Welcome to your inheritance. You're going to be a rat catcher, and that's not exactly what the village matchmaker calls a catch. In medieval Europe, pest control wasn't a weekend hobby or a phone call to some cheerful professional with a van full of traps. It was a full-time, life-consuming, soul-crushing profession that someone had to do, and unfortunately, that someone was going to be you. From the moment you could walk, your destiny was sealed tighter than a grain barrel that's actually keeping the rats out for once. Let's get one thing straight from the start. This wasn't glamorous work. There were no uniforms, no employee benefits, and certainly no pension plan unless you count dying early as a retirement strategy. You were essentially a medieval exterminator, armed with nothing but determination, some questionable tools, and the social status of someone who spent their days elbow-deep in rodent droppings. But here's the thing about being a rat catcher in the Middle Ages. You weren't just pest control. You were a public health warrior, whether you knew it or not. Every rat you caught was potentially preventing the spread of disease, protecting grain stores that kept entire communities from starving, and maintaining the delicate balance between civilization and chaos. Of course, nobody was throwing you parades or writing ballads about your heroic deeds. They were probably just grateful you existed, while simultaneously hoping you'd take your work clothes off before entering the tavern. Your training started young, really young. While other children were learning to milk cows or weave baskets, you were being taught the subtle art of thinking like a rat. Your father or master would crouch beside you in some dank cellar, pointing out gnaw marks on wooden beams and explaining the difference between fresh droppings and old ones with the enthusiasm of a scholar discussing ancient texts. You learned to read rat highways, those greasy smudge marks along walls where countless rodents had rubbed their fur while scurrying to and from their nests. The first lesson was always the same. Rats are smarter than you think. They're suspicious creatures, evolved survivors who've been outwitting humans since humans first started storing grain. They'll avoid new objects in their territory for days, sometimes weeks. They communicate with each other through scents and sounds you can't detect. They have backup routes for their backup routes. In essence, you were entering into a war of intelligence with creatures that had been perfecting the art of not getting caught since before your great-grandfather's great-grandfather was born. Your apprenticeship involved a lot of crawling. Not the dignified kind of crawling that knights might do while sneaking through enemy territory, but the undignified, clothes-shredding kind through spaces that weren't meant for human bodies. You learned to navigate the hidden architecture of medieval buildings, the gaps between walls, the spaces under floorboards, the forgotten crawlways that connected cellars to storage rooms. You became intimately familiar with the underworld of human habitation, the dark, smelly network of spaces where civilization's unwanted residents thrived. The tools of your trade were surprisingly sophisticated for their time, even if they looked like they'd been assembled by someone with a peculiar sense of optimism. There were various types of traps. Spring traps made of wood and iron that snapped shut with enough force to break a rat's neck. Cage traps that captured rodents alive for reasons that varied from merciful to deeply practical. And deadfall traps that relied on gravity and good timing to crush your targets under stones or heavy wooden blocks. But traps were just one part of your arsenal. You also carried a collection of clubs, specially sized for dispatching rats in close quarters. These weren't savage weapons. They were precision instruments designed to deliver quick, clean kills in spaces where swinging a full-sized club would result in you knocking yourself unconscious on a ceiling beam. You had your rat spear, a long, thin implement for poking into holes and encouraging reluctant rodents to emerge into your waiting trap. And then there were your hands, calloused and quick, trained to grab and dispatch rats with a speed that would have impressed anyone who wasn't too disgusted to watch. The really skilled rat catchers also used ferrets, weasels, and specially trained terrier dogs. These animal partners weren't pets, they were professional colleagues with their own expertise. A good ferret could chase rats out of burrows and into your waiting nets. Terriers had the size and agility to pursue rodents through spaces too small for you, but too large for a ferret. Working with these animals required its own set of skills. You had to learn their signals, understand their limitations, and develop the kind of partnership that made you an effective team rather than a human getting in the way of a motivated predator. Your typical day started before dawn, because rats are largely nocturnal creatures, and if you wanted to catch them, you needed to think like them. You'd begin by checking the traps you'd set the previous evening, a task that ranged from satisfying to deeply disappointing, depending on your success rate. Empty traps meant either you'd misjudge the rat highways, use the wrong bait, or the local rat population was getting wise to your methods. Full traps meant breakfast for your ferrets and a few coins in your pocket. After collecting your overnight catches, you'd inspect your territory. Every rat catcher had a territory, whether officially assigned by a lord or merchant guild, or simply claimed through the medieval equivalent of professional courtesy. This territory might include several houses, a granary, a mill, a brewery, or even sections of a castle. You'd walk your routes looking for new signs of infestation, fresh droppings, gnaw marks, disturbed grain, or the telltale smell of rat urine that marked their presence. The detective work was endless. Rats leave evidence everywhere they go, but reading that evidence requires experience and patience. Fresh droppings are dark and moist. Old droppings are dry and gray. The size tells you whether you're dealing with adults or juveniles. The location tells you about their travel patterns and nesting sites. Gnaw marks on wood reveal the size of teeth and the desperation level of the gnawers. Heavily gnawed areas suggest either a large population or a particularly determined individual rat who's found something worth destroying. You'd also talk to people, though these conversations required a certain diplomatic skill. Nobody wanted to admit their property was infested, but everyone wanted the problem solved. You'd listen to complaints about noises in the walls, missing food, and mysterious droppings while maintaining the professional demeanor of someone who dealt with these problems every day. Sometimes you'd get useful information about when and where the rats were most active. Sometimes you'd get wild theories about supernatural rat kings or accusations that the neighbor was breeding rodents for malicious purposes. The actual placement of traps was an art form that combined engineering, psychology, and a deep understanding of rat behavior. You couldn't just put a trap anywhere and hope for the best. Rats travel along walls, using their whiskers to navigate in darkness. They prefer routes that offer cover and quick escape options. They're suspicious of new objects, but will investigate familiar-smelling areas. This meant your traps had to be positioned along established rat highways, disguised or aged to seem like part of the environment, and baited with something irresistible enough to overcome their natural caution. Bait selection was its own science. Fresh bread worked well, but could attract other unwanted visitors like mice, or even cats who might trigger your traps prematurely. Cheese was reliable, but expensive. Bacon fat was highly effective, but likely to spoil in warm weather. Some rat catchers swore by fish heads, others by certain grains, and a few claimed that honey mixed with specific herbs created an irresistible lure. The truth was that bait preferences varied by location, season, and the individual quirks of local rat populations. You also had to think about trap security. A well-made trap was valuable, and leaving it unattended in accessible areas was a good way to lose your equipment to thieves who might want to try their own hand at rat catching or simply steal the iron components. This meant either hiding your traps very carefully or checking them frequently enough to prevent theft. Both strategies had drawbacks. Hidden traps were harder for rats to find, but frequently checking traps could leave human scent that spooked your targets. Poison was another tool, though it came with significant risks and moral complications. Medieval poisons were crude compared to modern rodenticides. Arsenic was available but expensive and dangerous to store and handle. Various plant-based toxins could be effective but often killed slowly and unpredictably. The biggest problem with poison was that rats didn't always die where you wanted them to. A poisoned rat might crawl into a wall cavity and die, creating a smell that would linger for weeks and attract other pests. Or it might die in a grain storage area, contaminating food supplies with its corpse. There was also the matter of unintended victims. Poison that killed rats could also kill cats, dogs, chickens, and occasionally humans who accidentally ingested contaminated food. This made poison a last resort for many rat catchers, reserved for situations where trapping wasn't working, and the infestation was severe enough to justify the risks. Your clients ranged from individual homeowners to wealthy merchants to religious institutions with large food storage operations. Each type of client brought its own challenges and expectations. Homeowners wanted immediate results and often blamed you personally when new rats appeared after you'd cleared out their cellars. Merchants were more understanding about the ongoing nature of pest control, but expected detailed reports on your activities and results. Religious institutions often had strong opinions about the moral implications of your work, with some viewing rat catching as a necessary evil, and others seeing it as part of humanity's dominion over creation. Payment varied wildly, depending on your client's wealth and the scope of the infestation. Sometimes you were paid per rat, which encouraged thoroughness but could lead to disputes about counting and proof of kills. Sometimes you received a flat fee for clearing a specific area, which was more predictable but potentially unfair if the infestation was larger than expected. The wealthiest clients might offer ongoing contracts, paying you a regular amount to maintain their properties rat-free, which provided financial stability but tied you to a demanding schedule of regular inspections and treatments. Working for lords or in castles brought its own unique challenges. Castle rat catching wasn't just about protecting grain stores, though that was certainly important. Rats in living quarters could chew through expensive tapestries, contaminate food prepared for important guests, and generally undermine the dignity that great households worked so hard to maintain. Castle rats also had access to more diverse food sources, making them harder to bait effectively, and more hiding places, making them harder to track down. The social aspects of your job were complicated in ways that modern exterminators might find familiar. You were essential but unwelcome, necessary but unpleasant. People needed your services but didn't particularly want to interact with you or acknowledge what you did for a living. You smelled like rat urine and death. Your clothes were stained with things people didn't want to think about. Your hands were scarred from bites and cuts from squeezing through rough spaces. Children found you fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. They'd follow you at a safe distance, asking questions about your work and daring each other to get closer to your equipment. Adults treated you with the cautious respect reserved for people who deal with necessary but unpleasant realities. You weren't quite a tradesman, since your work was seen as somewhat less skilled than carpentry or metalworking. You weren't quite a laborer, since your work required specialized knowledge and equipment. You occupied a social category somewhere between useful and unmentionable. The seasonal aspects of rat catching meant your workload varied dramatically throughout the year. Summer brought breeding season, when rat populations exploded and you could find yourself overwhelmed with calls for service. Autumn was harvest time, when full granaries attracted rats from miles around, and property owners suddenly became very interested in pest control. Winter drove rats indoors seeking warmth and food, concentrating them in human habitations where they were easier to catch, but also more destructive. Spring brought new breeding cycles and the discovery of winter damage that hadn't been noticed during the cold months. Your understanding of rat behavior was probably better than that of most natural philosophers of the time. You knew that rats were social creatures who lived in complex family groups with hierarchical structures. You knew they communicated through scents, sounds, and body language. You knew they were capable of learning from experience and teaching their young to avoid dangers. You knew they had individual personalities, with some being bold explorers and others cautious stay-at-homes. This knowledge made you effective at your job, but also created a strange relationship with your quarry. You couldn't afford to think of rats as evil or mindless pests, because understanding their intelligence and social structures was essential to catching them. At the same time, you couldn't allow yourself to become too sympathetic, because sentimentality would interfere with your ability to do necessary work. You developed a professional respect for rats that was similar to the respect that hunters develop for their prey. Acknowledgement of their capabilities combined with determination to overcome them. The health risks of your profession were significant and largely unrecognized. Rat-borne diseases were a constant threat, though the mechanisms of transmission weren't understood. You were regularly exposed to rat fleas, which could carry plague. You breathed air contaminated with dried rat urine and droppings, which could cause respiratory problems. You suffered frequent bites that could become infected. You worked in dark, cramped spaces that increased your risk of cuts, bruises, and more serious injuries from falls or structural collapses. Yet somehow, many rat catchers developed remarkable immunity to the diseases that plagued their communities. Whether this was due to constant low-level exposure that built up resistance, or simply natural selection favoring those with stronger immune systems, experienced rat catchers often survived plague outbreaks that decimated the general population. This gave you a certain mystique that enhanced both your reputation and your social isolation. Your tools required constant maintenance and occasional replacement. Wooden trap components had to be checked for cracks and wear. Iron springs and hinges needed to be kept clean and properly tensioned. Cage traps required repairs when desperate rats chewed through wire or wooden bars. Your clubs and spears needed to be kept sharp and properly balanced. Your nets and sacks had to be patched when they wore through from constant use. Some of this maintenance you could do yourself with basic carpentry and metalworking skills. More complex repairs required visits to blacksmiths or specialized craftsmen who understood the particular requirements of pest control equipment. These interactions were often awkward, since many craftsmen looked down on rat catchers while simultaneously charging premium prices for specialized work that few others required. The geographical knowledge required for your job was extensive. You needed to understand how rats moved through the human-built environment, which meant learning the hidden architecture of every building in your territory. You mapped the spaces between walls, the routes through cellars and storage areas, the connections between buildings that allowed rats to travel without being seen. You became an expert on the underground geography of medieval settlements, knowledge that occasionally proved valuable for purposes beyond rat catching. Your nose became a finely tuned instrument for detecting rat infestations. Fresh rat sign has a distinctive musky odor that's different from the smell of old droppings or abandoned nests. Large populations create stronger odors than small ones. Active feeding areas smell different from sleeping areas. Dead rats create unmistakable smells that help you locate bodies in inaccessible places. Over time, you developed the ability to walk into a building and immediately assess the scope and nature of any rat problem simply by breathing carefully and analyzing what you smelled. The psychological aspects of your work were challenging in ways that weren't always obvious. Rats are intelligent creatures who learn to avoid traps and modify their behavior in response to your efforts. This created an ongoing mental chess game where you had to constantly adapt your strategies to stay ahead of their counter-adaptations. Some rats seem to take personal pleasure in outsmarting you, leaving evidence of their presence in freshly cleaned areas, or somehow managing to steal bait without triggering traps. Success required patience, persistence, and the ability to think like your quarry without becoming obsessed with individual animals. Some rat catchers developed elaborate theories about the motivations and intelligence of specific rats they were pursuing. Others maintained strict professional distance, treating each rat as simply another unit to be processed. Most fell somewhere between these extremes, developing a working respect for rat intelligence while maintaining focus on the practical goals of their work. The learning curve for becoming an effective rat catcher was steep and never really ended. Rat populations evolved in response to human pest control efforts, developing new behaviors and preferences that required constant adaptation of techniques. Local rat populations might have specific quirks that took months or years to understand fully. Buildings were constantly being modified or expanded, creating new rat habitat that required fresh analysis and different approaches. Weather played a major role in your work patterns and success rates. Dry weather concentrated rats around water sources, making them easier to predict and trap. Wet weather drove them into buildings seeking dry shelter but also made their tracking signs more visible. Cold weather slowed their activity but concentrated them in heated areas. Hot weather increased their water needs but made them more active during cooler parts of the day. Your relationship with other trades was complex and sometimes competitive. Cats were natural rat hunters, and many households relied on them for basic pest control. This meant you were often called in to deal with problems that cats couldn't handle. Large infestations, clever individual rats, or areas where cats couldn't access. You had to work around existing cats without interfering with their hunting, while also addressing problems they hadn't been able to solve. Granary workers, millers, and food storage specialists often had their own pest control knowledge and opinions about the best methods. Some welcomed your expertise, others resented the implication that they couldn't handle their own rat problems. Successful rat catchers learned to present themselves as specialists brought in for particularly challenging problems rather than critics of existing pest control efforts. The moral and religious dimensions of your work were occasionally complicated. Some religious authorities viewed excessive concern with vermin as a distraction from spiritual matters, arguing that earthly problems like rat infestations were less important than preparing for eternal salvation. Others saw pest control as part of humanity's responsibility to maintain order in creation. A few even argued that rats served God's purpose by cleaning up human waste, and that interfering with them was presumptuous. Individual priests and monks often had practical views that differed from official religious positions. Monastery granaries needed protection just like any other food storage facilities, and religious communities often became some of your best clients. The contradiction between theoretical religious positions and practical necessities created opportunities for rat catchers who could navigate these tensions diplomatically. Your knowledge of building construction became quite sophisticated through necessity. Rats exploited weaknesses in human construction, so understanding how buildings were put together helped you predict where problems would develop and how to address them. You learned to recognize the signs of structural problems that created new rat access points. you could advise property owners on construction modifications that would reduce future infestations. This knowledge occasionally led to side work as a consultant on rat-proofing new construction or retrofitting existing buildings. Some rat catchers developed reputations as specialists in building modification for pest control, earning additional income by designing and implementing structural solutions to rodent problems. This type of work required different skills than catching rats, but built on the same fundamental understanding of how rats interact with human-built environments. The international aspects of rat control were becoming increasingly important during the medieval period, as trade expanded and ships carried rat populations between ports. Rats that arrived on trading ships often had different behaviors and preferences than local populations, requiring the new approaches and techniques. Waterfront rat catchers needed to understand ship-based infestations, which had their own unique challenges and opportunities. Some rat catchers specialized in ship work, either cleaning vessels before they departed or addressing infestations that developed during long voyages. Ship rat catching required different equipment and techniques adapted to the confined spaces and limited resources available aboard vessels. It also offered opportunities for travel that were unusual for most medieval trades, though the working conditions were often harsh and the pay irregular. Your retirement planning was essentially non-existent, since the concept of retirement didn't really exist for working people in medieval society. You worked until you became physically unable to continue, at which point you depended on family support, charity, or gradually starved. Some successful rat catchers accumulated enough resources to support themselves in old age, but this required careful management of income and expenses over many years. The most successful rat catchers often transitioned into training and supervising younger workers as they aged, leveraging their knowledge and reputation to maintain income while reducing the physical demands of the work. This created informal apprenticeship systems that helped preserve and transmit pest control knowledge between generations. The legacy of medieval rat catchers was largely practical rather than cultural. They didn't leave behind great works of art or literature. They weren't remembered in songs or stories, but they left behind communities with better food security, reduced disease transmission, and more habitable living conditions. Their work was invisible when successful and obvious only when it failed. In many ways, medieval rat catchers were among the first professional pest management specialists, developing techniques and approaches that influenced methods used for centuries afterward. Their understanding of rat behavior, trap design, and integrated pest management strategies provided foundations for more sophisticated approaches that developed as scientific knowledge expanded. The daily reality of being a medieval rat catcher was that you solved problems that nobody else wanted to deal with, using skills that took years to develop, in working conditions that were often dangerous and always unpleasant. You provided essential services that helped maintain the basic functions of medieval society, even though most people preferred not to think about what you did or how you did it. You woke up every morning knowing that your work was necessary, that your skills were valuable, and that your efforts made a real difference in people's lives. You also knew that you would spend your day crawling through dark spaces, handling dead animals, and dealing with infestations that would have overwhelmed anyone without your training and experience. In the end, being a medieval rat catcher meant accepting a role that was essential but unappreciated, skilled but unglamorous, necessary but unwelcome. You became an expert in the hidden architecture of human settlements and the secret lives of their unwanted inhabitants. You developed skills that few others possessed and knowledge that few others wanted. You made your living by solving problems that everybody had, but nobody wanted to discuss. The economic realities of your profession created a complex web of relationships and dependencies, that extended far beyond simple pest control services. Your income fluctuated wildly based on seasonal rat populations, the prosperity of your clients, and the general economic health of your community. During good harvests, when granaries were full and merchants were profitable, you could command higher prices for your services. During famines or economic downturns, you might find yourself competing with desperate people who thought they could do your job for less money, usually with disastrous results that eventually brought clients back to you. You learn to diversify your income streams out of necessity. Beyond basic rat catching, you might offer related services like general pest control for other vermin, consultation on building modifications to prevent infestations, or even the sale of rat carcasses to various buyers who had uses for them. Rat fur could be used for certain types of clothing or stuffing. Rat meat, though not preferred by most people, was occasionally purchased by the desperately poor or used as animal feed. Even rat bones had value for making glue or certain medical preparations. The seasonal nature of your work meant developing strategies for surviving lean periods when rat activity was low and demand for your services decreased. Some rat catchers took on additional work during slow seasons, often jobs that utilized similar skills like hunting small game or clearing pest birds from crop fields. Others used quiet periods to maintain and improve their equipment, scout new territories, or cultivate relationships with potential clients. Your reputation was everything in this profession, and building it required years of consistent success and careful management of client relationships. Word of mouth was the primary form of advertising available to you, which meant that every job was essentially an audition for future work. A single spectacular failure could damage your reputation in ways that took months or years to repair. Conversely, solving a particularly challenging infestation could establish your reputation and lead to steady work for years. The competitive aspects of rat catching varied depending on your location and the density of practitioners in your area. In some communities, you might be the only rat catcher for miles, giving you monopoly power but also making you solely responsible for all pest control problems in the region. In larger towns or cities, you might compete with several other rat catchers, requiring you to specialize in particular types of clients or develop unique techniques that set you apart from your competitors. Professional territories were sometimes formally established by guild regulations or municipal authorities, but more often they were informal arrangements based on tradition, negotiation, and occasional conflict. Disputes over territory could become quite heated, especially during busy seasons when lucrative contracts were at stake. Some rat catchers developed reputations for particular specialties: castle work, ship infestations, brewery problems, or dealing with particularly large or clever rat populations. The apprenticeship system for rat catchers was informal but essential for maintaining professional standards and transmitting specialized knowledge. Taking on an apprentice meant sharing your income and revealing your trade secrets, but it also provided additional labor and someone to eventually take over your territory when you became unable to continue working. The relationship between master and apprentice was complex, combining elements of parent-child relationships, employer-employee dynamics, and partnerships between professionals. Training an apprentice properly required several years of intensive instruction, covering not just basic techniques, but also client relations, territory management, equipment maintenance, and the countless small details that separated successful rat catchers from failures. Many masters required apprentices to work for several years before receiving any significant share of the profits, arguing that the training and knowledge transfer were valuable compensation in themselves. The tools and techniques of rat catching continued to evolve throughout the medieval period, as practitioners experimented with new approaches and shared successful innovations. Trap designs became more sophisticated, incorporating better springs, more reliable triggers, and materials that lasted longer under harsh conditions. Bait strategies became more refined as rat catchers learned to exploit specific behavioral patterns and dietary preferences of different rat populations. Some of the most successful innovations came from combining traditional rat catching with other fields of knowledge. Rat catchers who understood building construction could offer more comprehensive solutions to infestation problems. Those who learned basic veterinary skills could better manage their working animals and treat injuries that occurred during the course of their work. A few even developed basic understanding of what we would now call ecology, recognizing the complex relationships between rat populations, food sources, predators, and environmental conditions. The documentation of your work was minimal by modern standards, but some rat catchers kept basic records of their activities, success rates, and client information. These records served multiple purposes: tracking seasonal patterns in rat activity, identifying the most effective techniques for different situations, managing client relationships and payment schedules, and providing evidence of work performed when payment disputes arose. More sophisticated record keeping sometimes revealed patterns that weren't obvious from day-to-day experience. Certain types of weather might correlate with increased rat activity. Specific building configurations might be more prone to infestations. Particular bait types might work better in some locations than others. This information became part of your professional knowledge base, giving you advantages over less systematic competitors. The health consequences of your profession extended beyond immediate risks from rat bites and disease exposure. The physical demands of crawling through confined spaces, lifting heavy traps, and maintaining awkward positions for extended periods took a cumulative toll on your body. Many experienced rat catchers developed chronic back problems, joint issues, and respiratory conditions from years of working in dusty, contaminated environments. The psychological effects were equally significant, though less well understood at the time. Constant exposure to death, disease, and the darker aspects of a human habitation could create a distinctly pessimistic worldview. Many rat catchers developed a gallows humor and stoic acceptance of unpleasant realities that set them apart from people in other professions. This psychological adaptation was probably necessary for surviving the work, but it also contributed to the social isolation that many rat catchers experienced. Your relationship with the broader community was complicated by the fact that your success was often invisible, while your failures were glaringly obvious. When you effectively controlled rat populations, people simply didn't notice rats and assumed the problem didn't exist. When infestations occurred despite your efforts, everyone immediately wondered what you were being paid for. This created constant pressure to demonstrate value while working in areas where your most important contributions were essentially unnoticeable. The seasonal rhythms of your work created a calendar that was different from most other medieval occupations. While farmers were focused on planting and harvest cycles, and crafters worked according to market demands and material availability, your schedule was dominated by rat breeding cycles, weather patterns that affected rat behavior, and the agricultural calendar that determined when grain storage created attractive targets for rodent populations. Spring brought new challenges as rat populations emerged from winter survival mode and began breeding. Young rats were easier to catch, but appeared in larger numbers, requiring more intensive efforts to prevent population explosions. This was also the season when winter damage to buildings became apparent, often revealing new access points that needed to be addressed to prevent future infestations. Summer intensified your workload as rat populations peaked, and the warm weather increased their activity levels. Hot, dry conditions drove rats to seek water sources, making them more predictable but also more desperate and potentially dangerous. This was often your busiest season, requiring long hours and careful management of your energy and resources to handle multiple simultaneous problems. Autumn brought harvest-related challenges, as full granaries attracted rats from wide areas, concentrating them in locations where they could cause maximum economic damage. This was often your most lucrative season, but also the most stressful, as clients' tolerance for rat problems dropped to zero when their winter food supplies were at stake. The pressure to achieve rapid, complete success was intense. Winter offered some relief from the constant demand for services, but also created new types of problems as rats moved indoors seeking warmth and food. Winter rat catching often involved working in uncomfortable conditions inside unheated buildings, dealing with rats that were more concentrated but also more motivated to defend their warm shelters. The intellectual challenges of your profession were more complex than outsiders usually recognized. Effective rat catching required understanding animal behavior, building construction, human psychology, basic economics, and what we would now call systems thinking. You had to analyze complex situations involving multiple variables, develop strategies that accounted for rat intelligence and adaptability, and implement solutions that balanced effectiveness with cost and practicality. Problem-solving skills were essential because every infestation was unique in some way. Standard techniques provided starting points, but successful resolution usually required adaptation and creativity. You learned to read situations quickly, identify the most important factors affecting rat behavior in specific environments, and design approaches that address the particular combination of conditions you were facing. The diagnostic aspects of your work resembled detective work in many ways. You gathered evidence from multiple sources: physical signs of rat activity, reports from building occupants, observations of rat behavior patterns, and analysis of environmental factors that might be contributing to the problem. This information had to be synthesized into an understanding of the situation that guided your choice of techniques and strategies. Your knowledge of rat psychology became quite sophisticated through years of observation and experimentation. You learned that individual rats had personalities and behavioral quirks that affected their response to control efforts. Some rats were bold explorers who would investigate new objects quickly. Others were extremely cautious and would avoid anything unfamiliar for weeks. Some seemed to learn from the misfortunes of other rats, while others appeared oblivious to dangers that had eliminated their relatives. Understanding these individual differences was crucial for selecting appropriate techniques. Bold rats might fall for relatively obvious traps if the bait was attractive enough. Cautious rats required more subtle approaches that gradually accustomed them to new objects in their environment. Intelligent rats that had learned to avoid standard traps might require completely novel approaches that they hadn't encountered before. The social structure of rat colonies added another layer of complexity to your work. Rats lived in hierarchical communities with dominant individuals who controlled access to the best food sources and nesting sites. Removing the wrong rat first could disrupt colony structure in ways that made the remaining rats more difficult to catch. Sometimes it was more effective to target subordinate rats first, gradually reducing colony size without triggering major behavioral changes in the surviving population. Your understanding of rat communication was probably more advanced than that of most natural philosophers of the time. You knew that rats used scent marking to communicate information about food sources, dangers, and territorial boundaries. You learned to recognize the subtle signs of these chemical messages and sometimes used them to your advantage by placing traps along heavily marked travel routes or near areas where scent marking indicated high rat activity. The seasonal breeding cycles of rats required different approaches at different times of the year. Pregnant females were often easier to catch because their increased nutritional needs made them less cautious around food sources. However, Removing pregnant females was particularly important for preventing population explosions. Juvenile rats were easier to catch but appeared in large numbers that could overwhelm your capacity to process them effectively. Your relationship with working animals evolved throughout your career as you learned to communicate more effectively with ferrets, dogs, and other hunting partners. These relationships were complex partnerships that required mutual trust and understanding. A good ferret could pursue rats through burrows and spaces where you couldn't follow, but you had to understand the ferret's limitations and signals to coordinate your efforts effectively. Training working animals required patience and consistency over months or years. Young ferrets had to learn to pursue rats without getting distracted by other prey. Dogs needed to understand when to chase, when to wait, and when to retrieve. The investment of time and effort required to develop effective animal partnerships was substantial, but the increased effectiveness made it worthwhile for rat catchers who could afford to maintain working animals. The equipment maintenance aspects of your profession required basic skills in several crafts. You learned enough blacksmithing to repair metal trap components, enough carpentry to maintain wooden parts, and enough leatherworking to keep straps, bags, and protective gear in good condition. Some rat catchers developed considerable expertise in these areas, occasionally taking on side work for other crafters who needed repairs on similar equipment. Innovation in trap design was an ongoing process driven by the need to stay ahead of increasingly sophisticated rat populations. You experimented with new trigger mechanisms, different materials, and novel approaches to bait presentation. Successful innovations could provide competitive advantages for years, while failed experiments wasted time and resources that you could ill afford to lose. The relationship between your profession and emerging scientific understanding was complex and often contradictory. While you developed practical knowledge about animal behavior and disease transmission through direct observation, this knowledge was often at odds with prevailing theoretical explanations for natural phenomena. Your practical understanding that rats could transmit disease contradicted medical theories that blamed illness on bad air or divine punishment. This disconnect between practical knowledge and theoretical understanding sometimes created conflicts when you tried to explain your methods to educated clients who expected explanations that aligned with established scholarly opinion. You learned to present your recommendations in terms that clients could accept while privately relying on knowledge that came from experience rather than books. The geographical scope of your knowledge expanded as you gained experience and possibly traveled to work in different locations. Each region had its own rat species with different behaviors and preferences. Building styles varied between locations, creating different types of habitat and requiring different approaches. Local food sources affected rat behavior and made some bait types more or less effective. Understanding these regional variations was essential for rat catchers who worked in multiple locations or who moved to new territories. Knowledge that was effective in one place might be useless or even counterproductive in another. Adapting to new conditions required careful observation and willingness to modify techniques that had been successful elsewhere. The economic impact of your work extended far beyond the fees you charged for services. Effective rat control protected food supplies that represented significant investments by farmers, merchants, and institutions. The grain saved by preventing rat damage could feed families through winter or provide seed for the following year's crops. The secondary effects of your work included reduced disease transmission, decreased contamination of food supplies, and prevention of structural damage to buildings. Calculating the true value of rat control was difficult because the benefits were largely preventative. The food not eaten by rats, the diseases not transmitted by rat fleas, and the fires not started by rats gnawing through combustible materials were invisible successes that couldn't be easily quantified. This made it challenging to justify your fees to clients who saw only the immediate costs without recognizing the long-term benefits. The relationship between rat catching and broader patterns of medieval economic development was more complex than might be expected. Effective pest control was essential for the development of urban centers, which required reliable food storage and distribution systems. The growth of trade networks depended partly on the ability to protect stored goods from pest damage during transport and storage. In this sense, rat catchers were contributing to economic developments that would eventually transform medieval society. Your work also intersected with emerging technologies in unexpected ways. Improvements in building construction techniques reduced the number of hiding places available to rats, making them easier to catch but also concentrating them in remaining suitable habitat. Better food storage methods protected some supplies from rat damage, but increased the value of the food that remained accessible, creating more intense competition between humans and rodents for remaining resources. The professional knowledge that you accumulated over years of experience became a valuable asset that could be leveraged in various ways. Successful rat catchers sometimes wrote down their techniques and observations, creating manuals that could be sold to aspiring practitioners. Others focused on training apprentices who paid for the privilege of learning specialized skills. A few developed consulting practices that focused on advising property owners on construction and management practices that would reduce pest problems. The transition from active rat catching to other forms of professional practice was often necessary, as physical demands of the work became too much for aging practitioners. This transition required different skills and often different types of client relationships. Consulting work required more communication skills and the ability to explain complex technical concepts to people who lacked direct experience with pest control problems. The legacy of your professional knowledge extended beyond your own career through the apprentices you trained and the innovations you developed. Techniques that proved effective were passed down through informal networks of practitioners and gradually became standard practice throughout the profession. Improvements in trap design, bait selection, and management strategies spread slowly but persistently as successful rat catchers shared knowledge with colleagues and competitors. The cultural impact of rat catching was subtle but significant in shaping medieval attitudes toward pest control, public health, and the relationship between humans and animals. The existence of professional rat catchers demonstrated that pest problems could be addressed through systematic application of specialized knowledge rather than simply accepted as unavoidable aspects of life. This contributed to evolving ideas about human agency and the possibility of controlling natural phenomena through understanding and technique. And at the end of each day, when you'd checked your traps, cleaned your equipment, and planned tomorrow's work, you could take some satisfaction in knowing that your efforts stood between human civilization and the chaos that would result if the rats ever really took over. Because in medieval Europe, they almost could have. And people like you were pretty much the only thing stopping them. Your work was invisible when successful, obvious when it failed, essential whether recognized or not. You solved problems that nobody else wanted to deal with, using skills that took years to develop, in conditions that would have broken most people. You were part of an informal network of specialists who made medieval life possible by controlling the creatures that would otherwise have overrun human settlements, contaminated food supplies, and spread diseases that could devastate entire communities. In a world where most people lived on the edge of survival, you helped maintain the narrow margin that separated civilization from chaos, one rat at a time.